Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear about what's coming up soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher from McNally Jackson. And I am so pleased to introduce the author to you right now. Brandy Schillace is a historian of medicine and the critically acclaimed author of Death's Summer Coat, What Death and Dying Teach Us About Life and Living, and Clockwork Futures, The Science of Steampunk. The editor-in-chief of the journal Medical Humanities, she previously worked as a professor of literature and in research and public engagement at the Dietrich Medical History Center and Museum. And joining her tonight, I'm so pleased to introduce Ed Yong, who is an award-winning science writer who reports for The Atlantic. His first book, I Contain Multitudes, about the amazing partnerships between microbes and animals, was published in August 2016. His writing has also appeared in National Geographic, The New Yorker, Wired, The New York Times, Nature, New Scientist, Scientific American, and more. It's such a delight to have you both here tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Brandy, I'm very, very excited about this chat because I have read your book and it is truly wonderful. It is such a fascinating story and is so beautifully and elegantly told. And I think it has so much to say about the tension between science and ethics, between about our understanding of ourselves, about the boundaries between life and death. There are so many fascinating philosophical questions that this story of Robert White raises. And I'm sure we're going to delve into all of them over the course of this chat. But I guess to begin with, I really wanted to start at the beginning. I wanted to know how you came across this story for the first time and how you decided then to write an entire book about it.
So, it's a really interesting, it's great to be here, by the way. It's a really interesting story because unlike many other topics where I feel like I've chased down a topic to write about, this one chased me. It caught up with me twice, 2 different times. And on the second showing, I thought, okay, this is a sign. But it really came about because I had written Death's Summer Coat, and one of the people I had connected with was a neurosurgeon working a lot, or a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist working a lot on brain death, named Michael DeGiorgia at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And he had called me a few years earlier, just sort of out of the blue to ask me a very peculiar question. I think I was at a thrift store at the time, and he said, "Do you know anything about head transplants?" And I thought, "No, I don't." A year later, he called me and said, "I think you need to come down to my office." And that sounded interesting. So I headed down there, and he takes me into his office. He shuts the door, and he pulls a shoebox out of a drawer in his desk. He sort of sets it on the desk and pushes it at me. And I jokingly said, "Oh, there's not a brain in here." And he said, "Well, not exactly." So I opened it up, and it's a notebook. And the notebook was the research notebook of Dr. White when he was still a student. And it had these little rusty stains on it, which turned out to be like mouse blood or something. And it was all about his isolation experiments on mice brains, which were the beginning of this much larger arc of work that he ended up doing, postgraduate work, and then as a scientist and as a surgeon in Cleveland, Ohio, and also previously at the Mayo Clinic too. So it really started with a shoebox and a notebook and a peculiar invitation.
Okay, so you have what I think all good authors really need, which is a very good origin story for the book. But okay, so but then what happened? So how do you go from you know, the mystery shoebox in this random guy's office to thinking, I need to spend however many years of my life writing a full book about this story?
Yeah, well, it was kind of funny because once I got the shoebox, I found out that his daughter still lived in town. And I ended up speaking with her, and she had actually collected a lot of his work in kind of an archive. And she was very interested in someone writing his life story. And at first I thought, well, okay, you know, a biography, sure. But as I began to research his life, I realized that this is a really important time in sort of shifting understanding of what kind of science gets done and why, and its political aspects. So, you know, he starts off during the Cold War, and a lot of this becomes a kind of race between US science and, at the time, the Soviet science, and politics and science and one-upmanship, and kind of like the space race, but medically, over things like transplant science, is really kind of what comes to the fore during his years of research. And so I realized that it is a biography about a particular person and his interests, but it was also this marvelous nexus of the way his research and his life and career are cross-sectional across this period of time, where, you know, a real change in the way we think about scientific ethics was taking place.
That's fascinating. So for the for the people watching who may not have read the book so far, give us like the super potted summary of Robert White and some of the issues that you raise in the book. I don't want to delve too heavily into like spoiler territory, I guess, but just give us a little précis of White and what he did.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it really kind of begins in transplant science in general, because he was a student under Murray, Dr. Murray, who did the first kidney transplant. And he was a student at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, and he was there for when the transplant took place, and it was a success. And if people don't know, the reason they hadn't been a success before is there weren't immunosuppressant drugs yet. And so the reason this one was a success is because they were identical twins. And so they were able to take the kidney from one twin and put it in the other twin, and he lived. And White, so the story kind of begins there, and White thinking to himself, well, why do you just one organ at a time? What if you did the entire body at once and you gave them all of it from the skin on, and you just attach that to a new brain? Which sounds very Frankenstein. And that is kind of a point that the book returns to a little bit, because we do think of these things as fringe science until they become successful. And then suddenly it's mainstream and it's very well accepted. So it starts there. It then followed his career in doing a technique called perfusion, which is therapeutic hypothermia. And none of the transplant surgeries or brain isolation surgeries could have worked unless he had perfected that first. And what it does is the brain's very greedy. It wants lots of oxygen all the time. And if it loses even a tiny bit, you can suffer brain damage. So he realized that if you made it less greedy, if you basically cooled it, super cooled the brain, it didn't need as much oxygen, which meant you could do much more complicated brain surgeries. But also we use it today to help cardiac victims. If you have a cardiac arrest, it can keep you from having brain damage because they slow down the brain's needs. So a lot of his work was actually more in the area of perfusion. And technically that's what he's later nominated for a Nobel Prize for. But along the way, he could never quite get over his interest in, can you transplant the brain? Because for Dr. White, who was Catholic, that also means transplanting the soul. And he was watching the work of Vladimir Demikov in Russia. And Vladimir Demikov was transplanting dog heads, dogs' upper bodies, basically, onto other dogs and creating sort of two-headed dogs. The first one was named Cerberus. And of course.
Right.
And
kind of missing
White,
one, but.
Right. Yeah, you know, I've thought about that. Cerberus -1. But White saw that early footage in 1958, and that wasn't very long after the kidney transplant. And for him, that just solidified kind of an obsession almost. So he's a surgeon, he's saving lives, he's performing brain surgeries, he's perfecting techniques that continue to save lives, and he wants to take the heads off of things, so which upsets people. So it's a really peculiar story of someone who kind of has these two different goals, and that's what gives it that Jekyll and Hyde quality, really.
Absolutely, and I think it's so, like, there have been so many actual Nobel laureates who've sort of gone off the rails. I think that, like, it makes for this is such a fascinating narrative, and I think an actually reasonably common one of someone who has really made fantastic contributions, like really important life-saving contributions, but also dabbled into what was clearly fringe territory. And I think, like, that the title of the book explores that duality, and the book throughout really explores that duality in a fascinating way.
Thank you. And the title comes from two nicknames that he collected. He liked to refer to himself as Mr. Humble. And I have spoken to a priest who worked with him somewhat regularly. He was a friend of one of the popes. It's a whole other thing. And the priest described him as very humble, but no one that I've met who's worked with him ever took that very seriously.
Right, it's like, it's a very specific type of person who decides to call himself Mr. Humble.
Mr. Humble, right? And Dr. Butcher was a nickname given to him by different animal rights activists. And the animal rights features really, really heavily in the book, because when he began his research, a lot of the rules and laws that are in place now weren't in place. And so he clashed a lot with them, and some of that clash is ultimately a sort of a microcosm of what was happening widely as animal rights activists were trying to jockey with scientific research to say some of this is not ethical. You have to treat animals better. So.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things I loved about the story, that it just takes place over this really interesting time frame throughout much of the 20th century and up to, like, quite recently. Like, I really thought that this would be, like, quite well into the past, and I was really shocked to learn that, like, White was a consultant in one of the X-Files movies. But this idea that he's doing this work at exactly this time frame, where our attitudes to ethics, to animal experimentation, to this collision between science and religion is really radically changing, and that all of that is happening over, like, the course of this one guy's life, which I think is another sort of fascinating aspect that you really tap into.
Yeah, and he's a character in a lot of it as well. I mean, he was deeply involved in the brain death debates, and he wasn't actually in the original commission, but he was part of petitioning people at the Vatican to try and change the Catholic Church's definition of when life ends, not when it begins. That's a whole other argument, but when it ends. And originally it was respiration, and so to say no, that's not when life ends. White was basically saying it's when there's no brain activity. That's when life ends. The body can continue on, but you're not technically living anymore. And so he was really an active force in so many of these discussions. And I remember as I was researching different pieces and just watching him pop up again and again, and I thought, it's not just that you lived through these things, you were really in it.
Right. And did you, like, had you heard the name Robert White before you started doing this research? Like, how much of this story had you known about before?
Well, if you live in Cleveland, you've probably heard of Dr. White at some point. He's a pretty well-known figure around here, but I am a Cleveland transplant. Oh, no pun intended. So I hadn't known exactly that much about him, but he used to feature on a show called The Big Chuck and Little John Show, which is a Cleveland show. And he would be in skits on this television program. And so he was pretty well known around here. I had no concept that a head transplant had taken place already. Like, I just did not know that there had been a successful head transplant. It sounds like science fiction. And I actually interviewed Frank Spotnitz for the book, because he interviewed Dr. White, and he told me the funniest story, because he said when he first got the idea for the second X-Files movie, he sent people out to do some research, and one of his researchers came back and was like, "We have a problem. This has happened. We need to go talk to this person." So
amazing. All right, we're definitely gonna talk about the head transplant of a monkey, to be clear, for the people who are watching in a bit. But you talked a little bit. You talked a little bit about this already in the chat, about how things that we feel are weird at the time, then become things that we take for granted. And there's a lovely line in the book which I wanted to read out, which really gets at this, where you say, "We are never ready for the future. It comes to us at the speed of light, and we take risks and make change in the space of moments." Because today, organ transplantation works, because we've seen it done, heard of its success, and even met the recipients, it loses the terror and the magic that it once possessed. So tell us more about that terror and the magic. Like, how did people at the start of White's career think about the concept of transplantation?
Yeah, I think I almost had to re-weird it for us a little bit in the book, because there's a whole section about heart transplant, because of course, to many people, and still, this is still true, the heart is such an important organ to all of us. And we have a lot of emotional, psychological, philosophical things wrapped up in the heart. And to think that you're going to take a heart out of one person and put it in someone else, and that it's going to beat in that other body, then whose heart is it? Whose body is it? Do you then, does it become you? Or are you carrying around someone else? And I ask a question, if part of it, if it's your child's heart in someone else's body and you're listening to that heart beat through a stethoscope, which actually happened in one of the heart transplants, how does that make you feel? I mean, whose heart is this now? And I think that that's a concept we have kind of made it very sterile, and we think, yes, okay, they've had an organ transplant. But when you think about the specifics of it, it's still quite astonishing. Now you go back to before they were really, that successful. I mean, people sometimes lived weeks, days, a month if you were lucky, and yet they still thought it was worth doing. And so if you think about it that way, then there's this whole concept of you're doing these things, they may not be successful. And on top of that, there was real fear that there would be premature harvesting of bodies, that people of lower socioeconomic or racial minorities, that their organs would be taken to serve people who had more money or more cultural clout or were white or something like that. And so it wasn't just weird science, it was also deeply politicized. And this is all happening in the 60s. So, there's a whole extra level of tension about, is this right to do? What are the ethics of transplant? And so not only was it extremely unusual and very science fiction-like in some ways, it also carried with it real honest to God fears about what was going to happen to people if I get injured and no one's there to protect me. And it kind of made me think in a lot of ways of sort of like early grave robbery. It's like, I want someone to protect my remains in some way. So, and then add to that the fact that we weren't clear on when death happened, and that makes it even more complicated.
Right, and it feels like many of those fears are still very much present, or and poignant today, even if they're not necessarily about, say, a heart transplant. Like those fears of, or like those very reasonable fears that medical procedures will be misused to disadvantage marginalized groups,
absolutely,
or that or that that fine line between life and death are still questions that are very much live right now in public discourse.
Absolutely. And it's not just, there's the Terry Schiavo case, of course, which a lot of people know, but also the young lady who died after a routine surgery, as tonsillectomy, and they declared her dead and her family fought to say, no, she's not, she's going through puberty, she's still living. And so there's still a lot of friction there, because there isn't a single agreed upon definition of brain death still. You have legal definitions. The definitions are different, say, between the UK and the US. And I remember reading at one point that you could technically be considered alive in one country and dead in another, depending on how they wrote the law. So, it's no wonder the general public is confused about these things when we don't even have, and it's not because people are trying to elude anything. It's just, it's very complicated. Yeah, we know when something's dead, but the moment of death eludes us.
Right, absolutely, yeah. It's like it's like life and death, like sort of become a bit like art, right? Like you sort of know it when you see it, but it's very very difficult to define.
Right.
and as you said already, and as you write about a lot in the book, this isn't just a matter of science and like technical detail. White's religious beliefs play a huge role in his views on on these questions and what his duty as a doctor is. And that sort of led into this idea of doing a head transplantation. Tell us more about that, about how his religious views shaped his the narrative that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, in some ways, one of the things I noticed is I think a lot of us, whether we realize it or not, we compartmentalize things pretty well, right? And there was a sense in which there's Dr. White, the surgeon, there's Dr. White, the family man, there's Dr. White, the parishioner, right? And we're all this way. He's not unique in that sense. But what was more interesting to me was how he perceived his work. And one of the things that I have to say about Dr. White is he was very, very convinced he was correct, that he was doing for the greater good. I don't think he ever had a doubt, maybe ever, about that. And he really felt that he was doing God's work, and that saving life was the most important thing that you did. Saving brain life was the most important thing that you did. And there's a wonderful story in the text that it's a small little anecdote, but I think it says a lot about it. I had interviewed one of his old interns or residents, I guess, residency doctors. And a young man had come in after falling while playing soccer and injuring himself and had basically become paralyzed. And while laying in bed, he kept asking the doctors to kill him to end his life. And the resident was really moved by this, as any of us would be, and was like, I just feel so bad for him. I almost want to give him what he wants. And Dr. White was like, absolutely not. There is never a time when death is better than life. It is always our job to save life. And so for him, saving the life of the brain over the body was of paramount importance. And then to sort of illustrate White's point, years later, the resident met the patient again. And of course, he was still paralyzed, but he was also married and had children and had a good job. He'd had a life. And I think that there's a real ableist tendency for us to think that if you lose the ability to use your body, somehow that your life's not worth anything. Yeah. And anyone can, of the disability community can tell you their lives are worth just as much as everybody else's. And so in a way, I really appreciated that about White, that his devotion to saving life meant that he saw all lives as equal and worth saving. But it also blinded him to some of the ethical problems of the things that he was trying to do. And so it's really kind of interesting, if he feels that the brain is the soul and you are saving souls, then that always is going to him seem more important than some of the perhaps useful ethical quandaries that might need to be, pursued if you're going to go doing brain transplants on people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about their tension a little bit more, but I think before we do, it's probably time to start talking about this experiment, right? So the hair transplant experiment. I sort of don't want to go into too much detail about it. Like, I think for people watching, it's enough to know that he did transplant a monkey's head. I do want to ask, like, how do you reconstruct a scene like that in such vivid detail? Like, before we let everyone into this room, you told me that you almost felt like your duty was to make it less macabre. So tell me about, like, how you did the research. Like, how do you put the reader into the room when this thing is happening?
Well, partly I'm saving all of you from having to watch the videos. So there's film of these surgeries that the Cleveland Clinic, was it Cleveland? No, University Hospital still has, or Metro has. Somebody has these films in canisters, and you can get them and you can watch them. And they're disturbing. They're not in black and white either. So you're really witnessing a surgery happening, and of course, as with any surgery, it's sterile and it's clean and it's all the things that you expect a surgery to be. It's not butchery, but there's even I worked in a medical history museum, and I've seen things, right? Like, I'm hard to show. But you don't live around bone saws for years and be squeamy. But even I struggled with some of these images, and I thought, okay, like, I need to make this real for you. So actually, the real question is, how did I make it not too real for you?
Right.
Because I didn't want the book to be something that was just trading upon what can be quite gruesome, but is nonetheless scientifically utterly fascinating. And so I guess because I was fascinated, it was easy for me to replicate that experience because I felt like I was there. I was, I had a bird's eye view through the lens of the camera.
So you talked about the duality to white, like this tension between like the laudable aspects of the way he thought and some of the more questionable ones. But how do I was wondering about this when reading the book. Like you write a book that's sort of a biography of a person.
Yeah.
He's the protagonist of the story. You spend a huge amount of time inhabiting his mind.
Right.
And I feel like you can't do that without, to a degree, like ending up sympathizing with that mind. But the book itself is not. I think is fantastic because it's not a it's not a puff piece. It's not a it's not like a hagiography of Robert White. So like how do you as the writer work around that tension? And I guess like how did you end up feeling about Robert White as a person?
I think I'll start off by saying I was a professor for many years, and one of the things I taught a lot of was Gothic literature.
Right.
So I did quite a lot of teaching of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or a lot of teaching of Dracula, a lot of teaching of these Gothic narratives. And one of the things I always really appreciated about historical Gothic from the 18th and 19th century was the sense that the reason it appealed so much, and it was wildly popular, was because it taps into something that's actually in all of us. And so I think for me, aren't all of us strangely dual composite creatures? And so, in writing about Dr. White and this person who there's times when I think, what a wonderful man. And then there's times I think, what a jerk,
Right.
That's all of us. We all have these moments. And I felt like there was a real, a reality to the type of person that he was. And there was something laudable about preserving his duality, about not trying to carve off the parts that are really difficult. I mean, trust me, there's some difficult things in the book, things he did or said that are just very, very hard to accept. And then there's moments where he's heroic, angelic even.
Right.
And I thought, I don't want to take either of those poles out. I want to leave all the raw, messy, incongruous details about his life, because this is a book about how we define a life, and I don't think you can do it by making things pretty and tidy. And so I left them as messy as I really could, and I tried not myself to make judgments as I was working, but present things almost as though I were a camera lens for you, the reader, so that you could kind of come away with your own judgments. And I spoke to lots and lots of people. I mean, I spoke quite a bit to Ingrid Newkirk, who founded PETA, who had debates with him. I spoke to people who were his acolytes. I mean, I got a really interesting sense of who he was as a person. So I suppose the salient features of White, the things that stood out to me the most, were exactly the things that didn't fit neatly into boxes. And I think that's probably, to me, what made him such a fascinating character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's not just that he doesn't fit into boxes, but it's that like the understanding of him and his legacy just is so profoundly influenced by like our shifting cultural context over this time frame that we talked about in which he's operating. So you wrote this great line that White once said that coming up with a head transplant might have been the worst thing he did for his career, and that perhaps too near a connection to Shelley's Frankenstein had kept him from the accolades a half century of successful surgery ought to have delivered. So it's not just that he had that duality to him. It's that our understanding of the man's legacy, might have been very different. Like if he had done this like a century earlier, or a century later.
Yes, exactly. We're all so defined by the culture in which we come up in, and also the concept that time keeps moving on even if you don't.
Right.
And I do think that he lamented that quite a bit. He felt that the science and everything else was kind of moving on, and he wasn't being permitted to go along with it. He really didn't really want to retire when he retired. I think that given optimal health, he would have probably continued working as long as he possibly could. And yet the world was changing around him.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that the head transplantation idea has research, right? It's had a you know a sort of second phase of life, which you
It's
talk about,
reanimated.
right? Yeah, which you talk about towards the end of the book. Did you tell us about like how you work that into the story of White? Like, did you heard about that sort of story before you started working on the book, and how did you think about like approaching that?
So I think I began by saying that this book pursued me a little bit. So the very first phone call I received from my friend, the neurosurgeon, was about Canavero.
Right.
And so the CBS interview he was talking about was, had I seen that information? And it was the second phone call that ended up introducing me to Dr. White. So, so I had heard about him. Technically, I heard about Canavero's ideas before I began researching Dr. White. So I always knew that there was another person kind of pursuing these angles. But at the same time, you know, it was really the history, they're very different people in many ways, and they have very different goals. But it's definitely true that Canavero has not received the kind of accolades. I mean, he's actually been punished in some ways for his ideas in ways that White was actually funded for some of his ideas. And so I think it's another really good example of how times have changed quite dramatically. White actually, it seems to me, White felt that the end of the Cold War was also the end of support for these kind of fringe projects. That when we had an enemy that we were trying to beat on this kind of world stage, and it was all the men who stare at goats, that all that was all happening in the similar kind of time frame, you know, that when that went away and there wasn't that pressure anymore, that a lot of these other the fundings for these kinds of projects dried up. But I don't think he was giving as much credence to something just as important, which is that our concept of medical and scientific ethics have really changed, and what is okay and which populations are all right to use, and the way that we treat primates quite differently now. And there's been a real shift in understanding of what you can and can't do with primates as our nearest evolutionary relative. And so I think all of that was changing too, even if he didn't necessarily give it quite the same, you know, weight.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more questions, but at some point I'm going to open it up to the audience. If any of you will have questions for Brandy, please leave them in the chat, and I will check them out in about 5 minutes. I wanted to ask more about the process of writing the book. So, you know, after the shoebox, and then after you've convinced yourself that this is a story that's worth pursuing, what then? How did you put all these pieces together?
So I did this book very differently than any other book I've ever written, in the sense that the very first thing I did is I made a list of about, must have been 50 people.
Okay.
And I got a tape recorder because a lot of people were still living who had met White. And so I just went around and started interviewing everyone I could find. People who worked with him, family members, people who liked him, people who didn't like him, people who were angry still at him, people who had, you know, grave concerns about what he did, people who thought what he did should have gone further, like all of these different perspectives. And to me, that opened up a whole new world, because if you can't talk to the actual subject, the next best thing, maybe the best thing, is to find out about them. And to me, that suddenly the world became quite rich with life. And the next thing I did was I started going through archives of photography of the old. I love Cleveland, by the way. I love Cleveland. I'm from Cleveland. Cleveland rocks. It's true. And Cleveland has wonderful archive footage of these old buildings and the time period in which we lived and in which he lived, and the types of weather even that we were having during the time. These were the kinds of things I really wanted to dig into. I wanted to feel like I had walked the streets with White as he was planning his first lab in Cleveland. And that was really how I went about it. I would say it's almost like method acting. I really immersed myself in this book in a way I haven't done before with others.
And you touched on this a little bit, but did you find it a help or a hindrance to not be able to talk to White himself?
You know, I think in some ways, it was not a hindrance. I'll put it that it was not a hindrance, but it's partly because he was prolific. I have so much of his written material, so much of his written work. He'd done so many interviews. And in perhaps some ways, when you come at someone through the cross-section of people who loved and hated them, perhaps you get a better sense of who they are in a roundabout way. I'm sorry I never got a chance to speak with him, but I certainly ended up knowing really well people who knew him really well. And including, I went and spoke to the people at Big Chuck and Little John show as well. So all the way down to the pop culture references, I really felt like I got a wonderful view of this very, very complicated life.
Yeah, so Joseph Watts has a great question related to this, which was, did anyone of major importance flatly refuse to work with you on this book? And if so, how did you work around that?
I was never able to talk to the Pope, which was a shame.
That guy.
That guy.
So uncooperative.
White was friends with Pope John Paul II. I'm actual friends, and also knew Pope Paul VI. I have lots of photographs of them together. So he had also been part of the Vatican Council for Bioethics. He had kind of helped start that. And I really hoped that I might be able to maybe, even just a little pull quote thing. But no, I was not able to talk to the Vatican directly. I did actually speak to a bishop there, but times had moved on so much. Mostly people working in those roles didn't really know White anymore. So.
Huh, that's fascinating. I wonder if either pope will read the book. Are either of those popes alive? I don't know.
No, they're all gone. They're all gone. Yeah, they tripped the light fantastic before White did.
Okay, got it. What do you hope readers will take away from the book? Like, what do you your ideal reader closes the last page. What do you think they're left mulling over?
I suppose I have two answers to that. The one I will give as editor of the BMJ Journal of Medical Humanities is that I hope that they'll think about the ethics, how ethics have changed, medical and scientific ethics have changed, and how that and public opinion and public acceptance and politics are involved in science. I don't think that any of us are unaware of that now, perhaps, but I think that's a really important one. I guess me and my personal capacity, I hope that we ask ourselves really good questions about where we are, not who we are, but where. Do we really think we live in our brains? Are we composite bodies of brain and body and matter and environment? I tend to sort of feel more the latter. I think White was more of a Cartesian dualist and felt that the brain was quite separate from the body, but I feel like I might also be the ground I walk on. And I think that, I hope those are questions that people walk away with the book thinking about.
So Andrea Wood asks, do you see any connections or intersections between your thinking in this book and your first one, Death's Summer Coat?
I really do. Thank you, Andrea. I do. In some ways, I feel like this is a natural progression, even though I wrote a book in between them. Death's Summer Coat was all about our approach to death and dying and the rituals that surround that. But it also was asking questions about, when do we stop? And this book is asking that same question, but in a slightly different way. If brains can live outside of their bodies, the question about when do we stop becomes a really different one. If science and artificial respiration, all artificial life support can carry us forward, our concept of what a life is might have to adjust. And I think that that's only going to become more interesting and more complex as time goes on.
Christine Kalela says, if you had to take one major lesson from White's life to apply to your own, what would it be?
Oh, wow. I think pursue the thing that really matters to you. I am in some ways frightened by some of the things that he decided were okay to do.
Right.
I'm also in awe of some of the things he was able to do because he didn't give up. There's wonderful stories about children who every surgeon said, this is inoperable, this can't be done. And he invented new surgeries, literally just invented brand new surgeries to save children's lives. it's almost like every time someone told him he couldn't do something, he was like, well, we'll just see about that. And I think that's probably the thing about him I respect and admire the most, is that he wasn't willing to take anybody else's limitations for granted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so okay, so this makes me think that there's so much of White's personality that's almost like kind of tropey. Like he's very like classic movie anti-hero, right? He's the rogue operator who doesn't let people tell him what to do, and who goes renegade to save lives. And he's also, you talk about how he's so keen to invent new surgeries. He does it to stretch the limits of what science can do, that he doesn't ask questions about whether he should do those things at all. And that again feels very right. That's so, that has been a common trope in God knows how many science fiction movies. Did you find that in writing about White, that he was almost like archetypal in these many ways?
White thought that Victor Frankenstein was a hero and not an anti-hero.
Okay.
So we'll start with that. He very much saw him as the hero of that story, and that if you don't think so, you've misread it.
Right.
I taught it and I disagree, but I also it's hard not to be somewhat in awe of someone whose convictions are that strong about things. But I do think that he was archetypal almost because perhaps he aimed it that way to a certain degree. I do think he saw himself as a hero. He certainly felt in many respects that God was on his side. And this is particularly apparent in his clashes with PETA, because even when he got caught out in some of his own rhetoric, kind of got twisted and turned around on him a little bit when he perfected the monkey head transplant, and he said, I have discovered that I can transplant a soul. Then one of the animal rights activists basically said, oh, so monkeys do have a soul. And he had to kind of do that. That's not what I said. So he was caught out at times. And I think it's unfortunate that he didn't engage more fully with some of these animal rights activists, or not just them, but just other people who disagree with him, because he had a tendency to let his archetypal, I'm going to do this my way or the highway, sort of rebuff when maybe self-reflection and introspection might have been more useful to him. And that's something he did develop later on in life. And so the quote about him saying that might be the worst thing I ever did for my career comes quite late in his life. And I do think that later on in his life, he thought, maybe there were other ways to handle this. But yes, did I find him archetypal? Yes. And what's really fascinating is that I did not in any way embellish that. That's just who that man was. And I have, like I said, deep respect, awe, and also kind of fear and worry about, some of the things that he did. And it's just I'm going to miss working on him, I think. I'm going to miss this journey now that it's over.
Yeah. So I have a question on that, but I'm going to do the what seems to be the final audience question, which was, we've talked about the donor of the head, but this one is about the donor of the body, right? So was the question ever brought up of having the recipient of a new head agree to such a thing before it happened? What about the donor's family approving this use of the body?
Right. I'm so glad that whoever that is, well done. You.
That is Sally.
Sally, good job. So that's a great question, because this is why he was so invested in brain death, because he figured as long as you were declared brain dead and you were an organ donor, then all was free and clear. So if you were an organ donor, you were in a car accident, you were declared brain dead, regardless of what anyone else thought, as long as you were declared dead, he felt like, all right, we can proceed, and it's completely on the up and up, and it's completely legal. But as we just spoke about earlier, that's not everyone's perception of how these things ought to go. And this was certainly a fear during the early heart transplant stuff, that who gets to decide that it's okay now to take this particular organ. And so there's not like a tick, there's a tick box, right? You could like, yes, I'm an organ donor. There's not like, also you can have my whole body and put a new head on it, is not on the form. So it's not something you can kind of pre-agree to. And it did bother a lot of people. But one of the things that fascinates me is that the complaint wasn't so much what did the family think. The complaint was that single body is full of organs. And if they are an organ donor, you could have saved that lung patient and that heart patient and that kidney patient. And if you're taking all of those organs and giving it to one person, who decides that person is worth the lives of these other people?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it?
That's great.
Or Sally.
Or Sally. All right. I think the last thing I wanted to ask you was, you said you're going to miss work, living in White's headspace for a while. Now that you get to sort of put this into his story into your own little metaphorical shoebox, what's next? What are you working on now?
I am working on something already, actually. I was just putting the final touches on a book proposal this past week, which is like 40 pages long. It's continuing in the same vein. I'm so fascinated by about science, but also our public opinion about when and in how and in what ways science ought to extend life. So Clockwork Futures, which interrupted Death Summer Coat and this one, was really about what I call dread tech. And that is that technology actually, our ability to do things tends to outstrip our ability to understand what the consequences are of those things. So we want to have these new technologies, stem cells, there's lots of new technology, gene editing, CRISPR. And at the same time, we might be able to do things faster than our own culture can kind of, get our heads around. And so who gets to decide? Who makes those decisions? Do governments make those decisions? Do funders make those decisions? Do we as the public in our response to things on the media does Fox News make that decision? Like, who makes these decisions about science and what's real? So I think that's sort of the direction that I'm going in next, which is still looking at the future of these types of technologies, still looking at the past to where we start, but then looking at the future to where these technologies can take us, and how do we approach them in an ethical way that won't leave us with science fiction consequences.
Yeah, okay, well, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it. I would love to chat with you about that book when it comes out in a few years' time, hopefully in person. But thank you so much for talking to us tonight. To everyone watching, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Please go out and buy it from McNally Jackson. Thank you, Brandy. I hope the rest of this publicity tour goes really well, and I hope you're feeling really proud that this book is out there in the world.
Thank you.
It's truly wonderful.
It was wonderful talking to you, Ed, and great being at McNally Jackson, even if virtually. Someday I'm going there in person.
We'd love that. Brandy, Ed, thank you so much, and please buy the book if you haven't. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.